My daughter brought her new boyfriend to dinner. He looked like he had just stepped out of a magazine. Everything about him was absolutely perfect. The tailored suit, the charming smile, the way he spoke to the waiter. But under the table, away from his perfect smile, I felt it. My daughter's cold, trembling hand gripped mine. She squeezed it 3 times. 1, 2, 3, just like she used to do when she was a little girl, and something was terribly wrong. "Dad, save me." That was our old secret signal. But when I looked up at her face, she was smiling brightly, sipping her wine as if everything was fine. Was I just a paranoid old man, or was my daughter silently begging for her life right in front of me? If you are just tuning in, take a deep breath, because what I am about to tell you is a nightmare that unfolded right under my nose. I thought I knew the monsters of the world. I spent 40 years building a shipping empire in Seattle, fighting off cutthroat businessmen and actual criminals. But I never realized the most dangerous predator would be sitting at my dinner table cutting a piece of steak and calling me sir. If you have ever had to protect your family from someone they loved, hit the like button and tell me where you are listening from in the comments. I need to know I am not alone in this. We were sitting in one of the most exclusive steakhouses in the Seattle suburbs, the kind of place with dim lighting, heavy oak tables, and waiters in crisp white shirts. Evelyn had insisted on paying. She is 42 years old, razor sharp, and manages our family trust fund worth $40 million. She has always been fiercely independent, the kind of woman who commands a boardroom without raising her voice. So why was her hand freezing cold? And why was she gripping my fingers tight enough to cut off the circulation? Preston Croft sat across from us, commanding the conversation with effortless grace. He was telling a story about a medical conference he had just attended in Geneva. He claimed to be a renowned psychological consultant, someone who helped high-profile clients manage severe stress. He spoke with that smooth, melodic rhythm that makes people lean in and trust him instantly. Evelyn stared at him, but her eyes looked slightly out of focus, almost glazed over. I tried to catch her eye. I nudged her shoe under the table, silently begging her to look at me, to give me another sign. But she just kept staring straight ahead at her wine glass, nodding slowly at whatever Preston was saying. The vibrant, fiery daughter I raised looked like a hollow shell of herself. Then it happened. The moment that made my blood run completely cold. Preston reached across the table to grab a piece of bread from the basket. As he stretched his arm, the cuff of his expensive Italian shirt pulled back, revealing his wrist. My eyes locked onto the watch he was wearing. My heart stopped beating for a solid 3 seconds. It was a vintage Patek Philippe, platinum case, navy blue dial with a very faint scratch near the number 4. I knew every millimeter of that watch. I bought it in Geneva 30 years ago. I gave it to my wife Diane on our 20th anniversary. When Diane passed away, I placed that watch in Evelyn's hands. I told her to keep it safe, to pass it down to her own children one day. Evelyn cherished that watch. She kept it locked in a heavy steel safe in her master bedroom. She would never, under any circumstances, let a man she had been dating for barely 3 months wear her dead mother's heirloom to a casual Sunday dinner. Why is he wearing my dead wife's watch? The thought screamed in my mind, but my face remained perfectly still. Over the decades, I had learned to hide my emotions behind a mask of calm. I kept my breathing steady. I looked at the watch, then up to Preston's face. He caught me looking. For a fraction of a second, the charming, warm smile vanished, replaced by a cold, dead stare. It was the look of a reptile calculating its next move. Then just as quickly, the smile returned. "Oh, do you like the watch?" Harrison Preston asked, his voice dripping with false humility. "Evelyn insisted I wear it tonight. She said it made me feel like I was truly part of the family." "Isn't that right, honey?" He reached over and patted Evelyn's hand, the same hand that had just been desperately squeezing mine under the table. Evelyn blinked slowly, taking a deep breath before answering in a flat, almost robotic tone. "Yes. It looks wonderful on him, Dad." My stomach churned. The cadence of her voice was completely wrong. It was too slow, too measured, stripped of all its natural energy. It sounded like a hostage reading a script with a gun to her back. But there was no gun. There was only Preston smiling his perfect smile, cutting his medium-rare steak with surgical precision. I realized in that moment that I was sitting across from a very dangerous man. He was testing me. He was wearing the watch to see if I was sharp enough to notice or if I was just a clueless, retired old man waiting to die. He wanted to know if I would make a scene, if I would throw a fit and embarrass myself in a crowded restaurant. If I did, he would easily play the victim. He would look at Evelyn and say, "Your father is losing his mind." So I smiled back. I picked up my wineglass and took a slow sip. "It suits you, Preston," I lied, keeping my voice raspy and weak. "My memory is not what it used to be, but I always loved that watch. I am glad it is getting some use." Preston's shoulders relaxed slightly. He bought it. He thought I was weak. But under the table, I finally squeezed Evelyn's hand back. 2 firm squeezes. Message received. I am here. I needed to get Evelyn alone. I needed to break whatever spell this man had put on her. I waited patiently until the waiter cleared our plates. Preston wiped his mouth with a linen napkin and stood up, smoothing his jacket. "Excuse me for a moment," he said. "I need to visit the restroom. I will be right back and then we can order some dessert." I watched him walk away, weaving through the crowded restaurant, until he disappeared down the dark hallway near the kitchens. The second he was out of sight, I dropped the old man act. I leaned across the table, grabbing both of Evelyn's hands tightly. I looked directly into her tired, dilated eyes. "Evelyn, look at me," I whispered sharply, my voice carrying the weight of the man who used to run shipping ports. "What is going on? What did the 3 squeezes mean? Are you in trouble?" For a brief second, the fog in her eyes seemed to lift. Genuine terror flashed across her face. Her breathing hitched and her lips parted as if she was about to confess everything. But before she could make a single sound, a heavy, suffocating silence fell over our table. "Are we sharing secrets without me?" a smooth voice asked. I froze. A heavy, warm hand clamped down hard on my right shoulder. It was Preston. He had not gone to the restroom at all. He had circled around the dining room and was standing right behind my chair, listening to every word. The grip on my shoulder was too tight. It was not the touch of a future son-in-law. It was a physical warning. The grip a bouncer uses before throwing you onto the pavement. I forced my muscles to relax, leaning back as if I was unbothered. I turned my head to look at him. Preston smiled, but his eyes were devoid of warmth. He looked down with an expression of calculated dominance. "I was asking Evelyn about work," I said, keeping my voice steady. "She seems a bit distracted tonight. I wanted to make sure everything was running smoothly." Preston let out a patronizing chuckle. He released my shoulder and slid back into his seat. He folded his hands near his wineglass. "Evelyn has been under tremendous stress lately. The financial world is quite demanding, and she has a tendency to take on too much. That is exactly why I am here, to help her find balance." I ignored him and looked directly back at my daughter. Her posture had completely changed the second Preston returned. She was sitting up unnaturally straight, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "Evelyn." I pressed gently, ignoring the predator sitting across from us. "You squeezed my hand 3 times. You know what that means. Tell me what is wrong." For a fraction of a second, I saw the little girl who used to hide behind my legs during thunderstorms. I saw pure, unadulterated terror behind her eyes. She looked from me to Preston, and then something inside her just shut down. It was as if a switch had been flipped. A painfully fake plastic smile stretched across her face. It did not reach her eyes. "I have no idea what you are talking about, Dad," she said, her voice completely devoid of emotion. "I did not squeeze your hand. You must have imagined it." I stared at her in disbelief. Evelyn, please. Dad, stop it. She interrupted, her tone sharpening into something that sounded almost rehearsed. You are acting strange tonight. Did you mix up your blood pressure pills again? You know how confused you get when you take the wrong dosage. The words hit me like a physical blow. Confused. Mixed up pills. These were not her words. My daughter knew I was sharp as a tack. I managed a multi-million-dollar shipping company until I was 70 years old. I never missed a pill, and I never got confused. She was reciting a script written by the man sitting across the table, designed to make me look like a senile old fool in public. Before I could say another word, Preston leaned forward, his face etched with exaggerated theatrical concern. He reached out and gently placed his hand over Evelyn's. Harrison, you do seem quite confused tonight. Your face is flushed, and you are imagining things under the table. This environment might be a little too stimulating for you right now. He signaled the waiter with a snap of his fingers. The waiter rushed over. We will take the check, please, Preston said smoothly. I think it is time to get Evelyn's father home. He is not feeling well. I wanted to reach across and grab him by the throat. I wanted to scream and drag my daughter out of that restaurant, but I knew exactly what would happen if I did. Preston would calmly ask the staff to call the police. He would tell them I was having a dementia episode. Evelyn, under his control, would agree with him. They would put me in an ambulance, and Preston would take her. I would lose my access to her entirely. So I swallowed my pride. I did the hardest thing a father can do. I played along. I let my shoulders slump. I brought a trembling hand to my forehead, rubbing my temples. You know, you might be right, I mumbled, forcing my voice to sound weak and uncertain. I do feel a little lightheaded. The lighting in here is giving me a headache. Preston's smile widened a fraction of an inch. He had won the round, and he knew it. He paid the bill without glancing at the total. He stood up and pulled Evelyn's chair out for her. She stood mechanically, smoothing her dress, avoiding eye contact. The walk outside felt like a funeral march. Preston kept his hand on Evelyn's back, guiding her like a prized possession. I walked behind them, leaning on my cane to keep up the charade of a frail old man. My mind was racing, calculating every possible angle. The watch, the fake therapy, the 3 squeezes, the robotic lies. He was isolating her. He was dismantling her mind piece by piece. We reached the valet stand outside. The cold Seattle night air hit my face, sobering me up. The valet brought my town car around first. I opened the door, but before I got in, I turned to look at Evelyn one last time. Call me tomorrow morning, sweetheart, I said softly. Just so I know you are okay. Preston answered for her. He stepped between us, blocking my view of my daughter. Of course we will call you Harrison. Get some rest. Make sure you take the right medication tonight. We would hate for you to have another episode. He closed my car door for me. I watched through the tinted window as he led Evelyn toward a sleek black SUV. She looked small, defeated, and completely trapped. As my driver pulled away from the curb, I felt a cold knot form in the pit of my stomach. My daughter was not in a bad relationship. She was a hostage in plain sight. One wrong move and I would lose her. I promised to call her first thing in the morning. I had to hear her voice. As I rode home, I had a sinking feeling Preston would never let me speak to her alone again. I did not sleep a single wink that night. I sat in my leather armchair by the living room window, watching the cold Seattle rain wash over the empty streets until the sun finally began to drag itself over the horizon. My mind was a relentless storm of calculations, strategies, and deeply rooted fears. The image of my daughter's terrified eyes, combined with the desperate freezing grip of her hands under the restaurant table, played over and over in my head like a broken film reel. By 6 in the morning, I had already brewed a strong pot of black coffee. I paced the hardwood floor of my kitchen, watching the digital clock on the stove tick away the minutes. I was waiting for exactly 7 o'clock. 7 o'clock on a Monday morning was our sacred time. For the past 10 years, ever since she took over the management of our family trust fund, Evelyn and I had a standing Monday morning phone call. She is an early bird just like me. By 7, she would already be sitting at her massive oak desk, reviewing investment portfolios, checking international markets, and preparing for the week ahead. My daughter is a powerhouse. She single-handedly manages a $40 million portfolio with a level of precision and ruthless efficiency that used to make my own board of directors sweat. She is sharp, highly articulate, and completely in control of her world. She never under any circumstances misses our Monday morning debrief. Even when she was traveling through Europe or battling a severe winter flu, she would always call, her voice ringing with that familiar, confident energy. But as the clock struck 7, my phone remained completely silent on the kitchen counter. I waited 5 minutes, then 10. The silence in my house was absolutely deafening. The sinking feeling in my gut from the night before blossomed into a full-blown panic. The woman I saw at the steakhouse was not the sharp financial director I raised. She was a ghost, and now that ghost was missing her most important routine. At exactly 7:15, I could not wait any longer. I picked up my phone and dialed her personal cell number. It rang 3 times. With every single ring, my heart hammered harder against my ribs. I just needed to hear her voice. I needed her to pick up and tell me that last night was just a terrible misunderstanding, or better yet, that she was ready to fight back and needed her father's help to get rid of that man. The line clicked open, but the voice that greeted me did not belong to my daughter. "Good morning, Harrison," the smooth, honeyed voice purred into my ear. "You are up quite early for a retired man." It was Preston. The sound of his voice coming through Evelyn's private personal phone sent a jolt of pure ice down my spine. My grip on the phone tightened until my knuckles turned white. "Put Evelyn on the phone, Preston," I demanded. I did not bother hiding the cold steel in my voice. The fragile old man act was unnecessary when we were not in a public space. I want to speak to my daughter right now. There was a soft, patronizing sigh on the other end of the line. It was the exact kind of sigh a disappointed parent gives a toddler who is throwing a tantrum. "Harrison, you really need to calm down. Your heart simply cannot take this kind of unnecessary stress at your age. Evelyn is sleeping. She had a very difficult night after the dinner you ruined. Her anxiety is flaring up terribly, and she is completely exhausted this morning." "My daughter does not sleep in on Mondays," I fired back, keeping my tone deadly level. "She has a trust fund to run. She has early financial meetings. Wake her up right now." "That is exactly the problem," Harrison Preston said, his voice dripping with mock sympathy. "She is drowning in expectations. The trust, the money, the constant suffocating pressure from you. It is breaking her mind. As her partner, and more importantly, as her therapist, I have decided to intervene. I have put her on a strict digital detox for the foreseeable future. No phones, no emails, no stressful financial demands from her father. She needs peace, quiet, and professional psychological care. I am giving her exactly what she needs." "You are not her therapist," I growled, abandoning all pretense of being polite. "You are a man she met barely 3 months ago. You have absolutely no right to confiscate her personal phone or block her from speaking to her own family. Hand her the phone right now before I drive over there and break your front door down." Preston chuckled softly. It was a dark, chilling sound that made the hairs on my arms stand straight up. "That sounds like a threat, Harrison. And a very irrational one at that. If you come to the house making a scene, you will only distress Evelyn further. And frankly, with your bizarre behavior last night and your current aggressive tone, I am beginning to worry about your own cognitive decline. If you force my hand, I will have no choice but to call the authorities to protect her from your erratic outbursts. Do not make this ugly. Just stay home, take your pills, and let me heal her. I will let her know you called whenever she wakes up. Goodbye, Harrison." The line went dead. A hollow dial tone buzzed loudly in my ear. I stood completely frozen in the middle of my kitchen, the phone still pressed tightly against my cheek. The terrifying reality of the situation crashed over me like a freezing tidal wave. Preston was not just dating my daughter. He was building an invisible, impenetrable wall around her. He had her phone. He controlled her schedule. He was using the language of therapy and wellness as a weapon to sever her from the outside world. The digital detox was a total lie. It was a prison sentence. He was isolating her completely. By claiming she was mentally unstable, he was laying the groundwork to take over her life and steal her $40 million trust. He thought his smooth lies had outsmarted a helpless old man. He had no idea what kind of ruthless monster he had just woken up. I calmly grabbed my car keys. The drive to Evelyn's estate usually takes 20 minutes, but I made it in exactly 12. My tires hissed against the wet Seattle pavement. I gripped the steering wheel tightly, my mind entirely focused on my daughter. I bought that sprawling estate for Evelyn 10 years ago as a gift. It was meant to be her private sanctuary, a quiet place to escape the financial world. It sat on 2 acres surrounded by tall pines and a wrought iron gate. I knew every inch of that property because I oversaw the installation of its security system. As I approached the long driveway, I slowed my car to a halt in front of the massive black gates. I rolled down my window, letting the cold drizzle hit my face, and reached out to the digital keypad. I typed in the master override code, 4729. It was the exact code I had used for a decade. The screen flashed a bright red. Access denied. I paused, wiping a drop of rain from my eye, thinking I had simply pressed the wrong button in my haste. I typed it again, much slower this time. 4729. Again, the screen flashed red, accompanied by a harsh buzzing sound that echoed through the quiet morning air. Access denied. A cold chill crept up my neck that had nothing to do with the weather. I leaned out of the window and examined the keypad more closely. It was not just a changed code. The entire housing unit of the intercom and camera system was different. The sleek metallic casing I had installed was gone, replaced by a cheap white plastic model. Preston had not just changed the password. He had completely ripped out and replaced the smart home security system. He had locked me out of the very house I purchased. He was turning Evelyn's sanctuary into a fortress, making absolutely sure I remained on the outside of the walls. A normal 78-year-old man might have turned his car around, called the local police, and waited for someone else to handle it. But I did not build a shipping empire by asking for permission to enter my own territory. The police would be utterly useless anyway. Evelyn was an adult, and Preston would feed them the same garbage about a digital detox. I needed to see exactly what was happening inside that house with my own 2 eyes. I put the car in reverse, backed out of the driveway, and drove down the winding road. I parked my car safely hidden behind a thick grove of evergreen trees. I turned off the engine and stepped out into the pouring rain. The woods bordering the back of Evelyn's property were dense, overgrown, and soaked from the heavy overnight storm. There was no paved path, only a steep incline choked with wet ferns and slippery pine needles. I tightened the collar of my dark raincoat and began to push my way through the brush. The physical toll on my aging body was immediate. The thick mud sucked at my leather loafers, threatening to pull them off my feet with every single step. Wet branches whipped against my face, scratching my cheeks and soaking my clothes down to the bone. My knees, worn down from decades of climbing metal cargo ship ladders, screamed in protest as I forced myself up the muddy embankment. I slipped twice, catching myself on the rough bark of a pine tree, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I could feel the bitter cold seeping into my chest, but I did not stop. Every time my legs wanted to give out, I pictured Evelyn's terrified face in the restaurant. I remembered those 3 desperate squeezes of her cold hand. That memory fueled a fierce fire deep in my chest that burned hotter than any physical pain. I was a desperate father fighting for his child, and no amount of mud or rain was going to keep me away from her. After 20 grueling minutes of fighting through the dense forest, the tree line finally broke. I stood hidden by the deep shadows of the massive pines and looked out over the sprawling backyard. The back patio was a wide expanse of gray stone leading up to a wall of floor-to-ceiling glass doors that offered a clear view into the main living room. The lights inside were on, casting a warm, deceptive glow against the gloomy morning. I crouched low behind a large stone planter, ignoring the sharp pain in my lower back, and peered through the rain-streaked glass. I expected to see Evelyn on the couch, maybe sleeping, maybe reading a book. Instead, the room was completely empty of my beautiful daughter. But it was not empty. Preston was standing near the marble kitchen island. He was not wearing his perfect tailored suit today. He wore dark jeans and a fitted black sweater, his posture rigid and alert. But he was not alone. Standing across from him was a man I had never seen before. The stranger was short, heavyset, and wearing a cheap, ill-fitting brown suit that looked like it had been slept in for 3 days. His hair was slicked back, and he kept looking nervously around the room as if he expected the police to kick the door down at any moment. This man carried the unmistakable nervous energy of a street-level criminal. I wiped the rain from my eyes, squinting to get a better look. Preston spoke sharply to the man, his face twisted into an ugly, demanding scowl. The charming facade was gone. Preston reached into his pocket and pulled out a manila envelope. The edges of green bills were visible. He shoved it into the stranger's chest. The man grabbed the money, nodded, and handed Preston a small plastic bag in return. My heart pounded like a trapped bird. Who exactly was this very strange man? I stepped out from behind the planter and marched to the glass doors. I raised my fist and slammed it against the pane. The heavy thud echoed sharply over the rain. Inside, both men flinched. The stranger in the brown suit jumped back, his eyes darting toward the glass like a cornered rat. Preston whipped his head around his face, contorting into a mask of pure rage. For a split second, the facade slipped, revealing the predator underneath. But Preston was a professional. In the blink of an eye, he shoved the small plastic bag into his pocket and kicked the thick envelope under the marble island. He whispered something harsh to the strange man, who immediately turned and scurried down the hallway, disappearing from sight. Preston took a deep breath, smoothed his black sweater, and slid the heavy door open just enough to step into the doorway, blocking my path. The warm air hit my freezing-soaked face. Preston looked me up and down, taking in my muddy shoes and scratched cheeks. "Harrison, what on earth are you doing out here?" he asked, his voice dripping with exaggerated concern, though his eyes remained furious. "You are entirely soaked. You could catch pneumonia sneaking around in the mud like a trespasser. I told you on the phone Evelyn was resting." "Move out of my way, Preston," I growled, planting my muddy shoes firmly on the pristine threshold. "I am not leaving this property until I see my daughter with my own eyes." He crossed his arms, filling the doorway. "I cannot let you do that, Harrison. You are acting erratic and hostile. You broke the security gate, and now you are prowling around the bushes. This is exactly the toxic behavior that caused Evelyn's mental breakdown. I am trying to protect her peace. I will ask you to leave immediately, or I will call the police to escort you away." "Call them," I challenged, my voice rising above the storm. "Call the police right now. Let us have them search your pockets and look under that marble island. Let us see how they feel about the transaction I just watched through the window." Preston's eyes narrowed. The air between us grew heavy. He knew I had seen something, but he was calculating how much I understood. Before he could formulate another lie, a soft shuffling sound came from the top of the grand wooden staircase behind him. "Dad," a fragile voice called. Preston immediately turned his head, and I pushed past his shoulder, stepping into the warm foyer. I looked up toward the landing, and my heart shattered inside my chest. It was Evelyn, but she looked nothing like the fiercely independent woman I raised. She looked like a living ghost. She wore a baggy gray sweatsuit that swallowed her slender frame. Her beautiful blonde hair hung in greasy, unwashed strands. Dark circles framed her eyes. But it was the eyes themselves that terrified me most. They were blown wide open, the pupils massively dilated, staring right through me as if I was barely there. She held the mahogany banister with trembling fingers, making her way down the steps with the unsteady gait of an 80-year-old woman. "Sweetheart," I whispered, rushing to the stairs, ignoring Preston's heavy presence breathing down my neck. "What has happened to you? Are you sick? Let me take you to a doctor." Evelyn stopped on the bottom step. She did not reach out. She just stood there, swaying slightly, staring at my muddy coat. When she spoke, her voice was a slow, hypnotic drawl. Every word sounded thick and heavy as if she was trying to speak from the bottom of a pool. "I am just tired, Dad," she murmured, blinking sluggishly. "You do not need to worry. I am just so tired. Preston is taking care of my mind. He says I need to rest." The phrase made my stomach churn. Taking care of my mind. It was a sick, programmed response. He had drilled those words into her head while pumping her full of whatever garbage was in that bag. I felt a surge of murderous rage toward the man standing a few feet away, but I swallowed it down. I had to focus on Evelyn. I stepped onto the stair and wrapped my arms around her. She felt incredibly frail, her bones pressing sharply against her clothes. As I pulled her close, resting my chin against her shoulder, I felt her body tense. And then I felt it. Her hand moved slowly, sliding down my back. As her hand brushed against my side, I felt a hard, rectangular object pressing against my lower ribs from inside her sweatpants pocket. It was a phone. Not the sleek smartphone she used for work, but a small, thick burner phone. In that brief embrace, while Preston watched with cold eyes, Evelyn pressed the phone against my side. With a sudden, desperate surge of strength, she slipped the device straight into the deep side pocket of my wet raincoat. She patted my pocket twice, a silent, frantic confirmation. I pulled away from the hug, keeping my face a mask of worried sorrow. I looked at her dilated eyes. Deep beneath the chemical fog, I saw a tiny, desperate spark of the real Evelyn fighting to survive. She was still in there. She had just handed me her only lifeline. I nodded slowly, playing the defeated father. "Okay, sweetheart," I said softly. "You rest. I will leave you to your peace." I turned and looked Preston in the eyes. I let my shoulders slump, pretending the fight had drained out of my old bones. "I will go home now, Preston. Please make sure she is safe." He smiled that cold smile, victorious again. "Oh, I promise you, Harrison. I will take exceptionally good care of her." I walked back out into the rain, clutching the phone inside my coat, knowing the war had begun. I made my way through the woods, ignoring the branches whipping my face. My mind was focused on the heavy object burning a hole in my pocket. When I reached my car, hidden behind the pines, I slammed the door shut, locking myself inside. I cranked the heater as my hands shaking violently from the freezing rain and adrenaline. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the cheap plastic burner phone. The screen was cracked, and the battery was flashing red, hanging on by a single thread. I pressed the button to unlock it. There were no call logs or saved contacts. There was only one single draft message saved in the outbox. Evelyn had desperately tried to send it before Preston caught her. 5 words that made my blood run entirely cold. "He is watching the cameras. Help." I stared at the glowing screen as the heater blasted hot air against my clothes. The cameras. That explained everything. It explained why Preston had ripped out my old security system and installed his own. He was not keeping intruders out. He was keeping my daughter locked in, monitoring her every single move, every spoken word, and every breath she took inside that house. If I drove away right now and called the police, Preston would see them coming on the perimeter cameras. He would take Evelyn out the back door, throw her in his car, and disappear before the first squad car reached the driveway. With the toxic chemicals he was pumping into her system, she would not even have the presence of mind to fight back. Or worse, he would simply show the police her medical records, claim I was a harassing estranged father, and file a restraining order against me. I could not fight him with brute force. I had to fight him with strategy. I had to make him believe that the threat outside the gates was completely neutralized. I needed him to lower his guard. I turned off the car engine. I took a deep breath, letting the cold reality of what I had to do wash over me. I stepped back out into the freezing rain, but this time I did not sneak through the muddy woods. I walked straight up the paved driveway, dragging my feet, letting my shoulders slump heavily forward. I walked to the front door and pressed the glowing doorbell. The door swung open, and Preston stood there, his jaw clenched in absolute fury. "Harrison, I thought I told you to leave," he snapped, no longer bothering to hide his venom. "What is your problem?" But I did not yell back. Instead, I let my lower lip tremble. I forced the moisture in my eyes to spill over, letting hot tears mix with the rain on my cheeks. "Preston," I mumbled, my voice cracking pitifully. "I am so sorry. I am just so confused. I do not know how I got back here. Where is my car? I cannot remember where I parked my car." Preston paused, his hostile expression faltering as he studied my pathetic state. I wrapped my arms around myself, shivering violently, and let out a loud, pathetic sob. "I am so cold, Preston. Please, I just need to sit down for a minute. My chest hurts so much. I think my memory is slipping again." The anger in his eyes quickly dissolved, replaced by a dark, arrogant amusement. He was watching a powerful titan of industry crumble into a helpless, senile old fool right on his doorstep. "Come inside, Harrison," he sighed, adopting that sickly, sweet therapist voice again. "Let us get you warmed up." He led me into the grand living room. He brought me a cup of tea on a porcelain saucer. My hands shook violently on purpose. As I reached for the cup, I let my fingers slip. The expensive teacup crashed onto the hardwood floor, shattering into a dozen pieces, splashing hot tea across his expensive shoes. "Oh my God!" I cried out, dropping to my knees and attempting to pick up the jagged pieces with my bare, trembling hands. "I am so sorry. I am so clumsy. My mind is just completely gone today. I thought Evelyn was in trouble, but I was just confused. I am so sorry, Preston. Please do not tell her I made a mess." Preston looked down at me, kneeling in the spilled tea. The smug satisfaction radiating from him was absolutely sickening. He truly believed he had completely broken me. "Do not worry about the mess, Harrison," he said smoothly, stepping back to avoid the tea. "The maid will clean it. You are clearly suffering from severe cognitive decline. You should go home and rest. You are no threat to anyone, just a confused old man." He helped me to my feet, guiding me toward the front door with a firm grip on my arm. But as we passed the kitchen island, I glanced over his shoulder. I saw the small plastic bag the stranger had given him. It was open. Next to it sat Evelyn's daily vitamin organizers. But Preston was not putting vitamins into those little plastic compartments. He was taking unlabeled, chalky white capsules from the bag and carefully slipping them in amongst her regular supplements. He was hiding the poison in plain sight. I kept my eyes vacant, nodding like an idiot as he pushed me out the door. "Thank you, Preston," I mumbled weakly. "You are a good man. Take care of my girl." I shuffled down the driveway, my head bowed in defeat. But the moment the gates closed behind me, my tears stopped instantly. The shaking in my hands disappeared. My posture straightened into sharp, rigid lines. Preston thought he had just dealt with a senile, toothless old lion. He was dead wrong. I now had her burner phone. I knew how he was drugging her, and I knew exactly what I had to do next to destroy him. I drove straight to the diner on the industrial side of the city. I did not go home to change my wet clothes. I needed to move fast. The rain was still coming down in heavy sheets, washing the mud from my tires as I navigated the slick streets. The diner was a relic from the 1970s, sitting under the shadow of the old overpass. It was a place frequented by dock workers, truck drivers, and night shift mechanics. More importantly, it was incredibly loud. The constant clatter of heavy ceramic plates, the hiss of the deep fryer, and the blaring jukebox made it impossible for anyone to eavesdrop or plant listening devices. If Preston had somehow managed to track my car or bug my phone, this environment would render his surveillance completely useless. I parked in the back alley and walked through the rusted kitchen door, tossing a $50 bill to the cook, who simply nodded at me. I slid into a sticky vinyl booth in the darkest corner of the restaurant. Sitting across from me was Martin Gallagher. Martin and I go back over 30 years. He is a retired Federal Bureau of Investigation agent who now runs a highly discreet private intelligence firm. He is a man carved from solid granite, with sharp gray eyes that miss absolutely nothing. He was drinking his coffee black, reading a newspaper, looking like any other retired man trying to escape the rain. But beneath that quiet exterior was the most lethal investigator on the West Coast. I slid into the booth opposite him. I did not bother with pleasantries. I reached into my damp raincoat, pulled out Evelyn's cracked burner phone, and slid it across the scratched table. Martin glanced at the phone, then looked up at my scratched face and soaked clothes. He folded his newspaper neatly and set it aside. "You look like you just crawled out of a storm drain, Harrison. What kind of trouble have you stepped into this time?" "I need you to hunt a man down," I said, keeping my voice low, leaning over the table so only he could hear me. "His name is Preston Croft, or at least that is what he calls himself. He claims to be a high-end psychological consultant. He is currently living in Evelyn's house. He has her completely isolated. He replaced her security system, confiscated her personal electronics, and he is pumping her full of unknown, unmarked chemical compounds, disguised as daily vitamin supplements." Martin picked up the burner phone, turning it over in his large hands. He did not show shock. He never did. He just processed the data with cold calculation. "He is drugging her to gain control of the trust fund," Martin stated quietly. It was not a question. It was a cold fact. "Yes," I replied, staring at my trembling hands. I had to play the part of a senile, broken old man just to get off the property alive without him moving her. I saw him paying off a street thug for a bag of pills. "I need to know everything about him, Martin. Where he came from, who he really is, and how I can tear his life apart piece by piece." Martin studied me for a long moment. People who only knew me from the country club thought I was just a lucky businessman who inherited some boats. But Martin knew the truth. He knew exactly how I built my shipping empire. Back in the 80s, the Seattle ports were infested with organized crime rings, smugglers, and cargo thieves. You did not survive in that brutal industry by being soft or asking politely. You survived by being more ruthless than the criminals trying to steal from you. I spent decades crushing smuggling operations, dismantling corrupt labor unions, and protecting my fleet with an iron fist. Martin and I had worked together back when he was a young federal agent, taking down a massive international cartel operation that tried to use my cargo ships to move illegal contraband. He knew I was perfectly capable of destroying a man if I needed to. "I will need exactly 12 hours, Martin said, slipping the burner phone into his dark jacket pocket. "I will run the facial recognition algorithms, dig into his financial footprints, and check the offshore medical registries. If this guy has ever left a digital shadow, I will find it. Go home, Harrison. Take a hot shower. Do not contact the local police and do not call Evelyn's house under any circumstances. You need to remain the helpless old man until we have the ammunition to strike." I nodded, standing up from the booth. "Find the poison, Martin. Find the absolute worst thing he is hiding." I left the diner and drove back to my empty house. The adrenaline that had carried me through the morning slowly began to fade, replaced by a deep, agonizing exhaustion. I stripped off my ruined clothes, stood under a scalding hot shower for 20 minutes, and tried to wash the image of Evelyn's vacant eyes from my mind. But I simply could not. I spent the rest of the day pacing my study like a caged animal. I stared at the grandfather clock ticking away in the corner. Every single hour felt like an eternity. I imagined Preston giving her another dose of those white capsules. I imagined her brilliant mind slowly slipping further into the darkness. I poured a heavy glass of bourbon, but did not drink a single drop of it. Instead, I unlocked my gun safe and polished my old hunting rifle just to keep my hands busy. I did not intend to shoot him, but the weight of the cold steel grounded me. It reminded me that I was still a protector. I was a father preparing for war. At exactly 8 o'clock that evening, my private landline rang loudly. It was an encrypted line Martin and I set up years ago for sensitive matters. I snatched the receiver off the cradle before the second ring could even finish. "Tell me you have something," I said immediately, my heart pounding in my chest. The line crackled softly before Martin's voice came through, sounding incredibly grim and tightly wound. "I have something, Harrison. But it is much worse than just a con man trying to steal a trust fund." "What is it?" I demanded, my grip tightening on the heavy plastic receiver until my knuckles turned white. I ran the name Preston Croft through every state medical board and federal registry. Martin said, his voice dropping an octave into a deadly serious tone. "There is absolutely no record of a Dr. Preston Croft anywhere in the country. He does not have a medical license, and that is not his real name." The silence on the line was absolute. Not his real name. I repeated the words slowly, trying to grasp the magnitude of what Martin was telling me. The man sleeping under the same roof as my daughter did not exist. I told Martin to come to my house immediately. Within 20 minutes, the heavy oak door of my home clicked open, and Martin stepped into my study. He carried a thick manila folder. He dropped it onto the center of my mahogany desk with a heavy thud. I opened the folder. The first page was a chaotic web of financial aliases, dummy corporations, and redacted background checks. Martin stood by the fireplace, his face carved from stone. "Preston Croft is a ghost, Harrison," Martin explained quietly. "He has no birth certificate under that name, no social security history prior to 10 years ago, and no collegiate records. Whoever he really is, he erased his past completely. But what he could not erase were the financial footprints of the women he left behind." I turned the page and my blood ran cold. Staring back at me was a photograph of a beautiful, vibrant woman in her early 40s. Her name was Victoria. She was the heiress to a massive real estate fortune. Martin pointed a finger at the photograph. He married her 8 years ago. Within 6 months of the wedding, Victoria began suffering from severe cognitive decline. She experienced memory loss, paranoia, and erratic behavior. I stared at the photo, my chest tightening, as the horrific reality took shape. Her family thought it was stress. Martin continued, his voice steady, but laced with simmering anger. Then they brought in a private specialist recommended by her loving husband. The diagnosis was tragic and incredibly rare. Early onset dementia. Within a year, Victoria was incapacitated. She could not speak, she could not feed herself, and she could not manage her real estate empire. Preston took over everything legally. He became her power of attorney, her legal guardian, and the sole trustee of her wealth. He liquidated her assets, transferred the funds into offshore accounts, and then quietly disappeared. I looked up from the file, my throat dry. "Where is she now?" I asked, dreading the answer. "She is locked in a state psychiatric facility in Illinois," Martin replied. "She is a permanent ward of the state. Her brain is completely destroyed." She was not his only victim. He reached over and flipped the page. Another photograph stared up at me. This time it was a woman named Elena. She was the chief executive officer of a tech startup. 5 years ago, she married a charming psychological consultant. A year later, she suffered the exact same tragic fate. Rapid mental decline, a sudden diagnosis of early-onset dementia, and a total transfer of her corporate assets to her husband before she was institutionalized. She is currently sitting in a facility in Texas, unable to remember her own name. Preston drained her accounts and vanished. And now he has moved to Seattle. He has found his third target. I fell back into my leather chair, staring at the faces of these ruined women. The white capsules, the chalky pills Preston was slipping into Evelyn's vitamin organizer. He was not just keeping her docile. He was destroying her brain. He was using a synthetic chemical compound to induce the symptoms of dementia. He was burning away her memories, her personality, and her independence to create a legally binding excuse to take control of her trust fund. It was the most evil scheme I had ever encountered. If I had called the police and reported him for abuse, he would have vanished. He would have slipped away into the night with his offshore accounts, leaving Evelyn broken. He had done it twice before, and the law had never caught him because everything looked like a tragic medical decline managed by a grieving husband. The anger inside me boiled over. I slammed my fist on the desk. "We have to stop him," I growled, my voice trembling with fury. "We have to go to the house right now and drag him out into the street. We have the proof." But Martin shook his head slowly. "This file is circumstantial, Harrison. These are patterns, not concrete evidence of a crime in Seattle. The local police will not arrest a man based on a private investigator's hunch about previous marriages. Worse, we are completely out of time." Martin reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a single sheet of paper. He placed it carefully on top of the file. It was a copy of a legal document stamped with the official seal of the county clerk. "What is this?" I asked, leaning forward to read the text. "That is a marriage license application," Martin said, his voice dropping into a deadly tone. "It was filed yesterday morning at the downtown courthouse. Preston Croft has officially applied for a marriage license with your daughter." I read the names printed on the paper. Evelyn Blake and Preston Croft. The date of the ceremony was stamped at the bottom. The wedding is in exactly 2 weeks. Martin leaned over the desk, his gray eyes locking onto mine with terrifying intensity. "Do you understand what this means? If he marries her while she is in this chemically altered state, he becomes her legal next of kin. He will instantly gain medical proxy and control over her assets. Once that ring goes on her finger, he can legally lock her in a psychiatric ward for the rest of her life, and you will not have the legal standing to even visit her. He knows you are suspicious, and he is rushing to seal the trap." 2 weeks. I had 14 days to save my daughter's mind, her life, and her fortune. If I made one wrong move, Preston would pack her into a car and disappear. The walls were closing in on us. I stared at the marriage license application sitting on my desk, feeling a cold, suffocating weight pressing down on my chest. Martin watched me in silence. He understood the law just as well as I did. In Washington, once that gold ring was placed on my daughter's finger, my rights as her father would be instantly obliterated. Spousal rights would absolutely supersede everything else. Preston would become her immediate next of kin. He would have unquestionable authority over her medical care. If I intervened, he could legally have me arrested for harassment. Martin stood up from his chair, buttoning his dark coat against the freezing rain that battered the windows. "I will keep digging into his shadows." "Harrison," he said quietly, "but you need to figure out your next move very carefully. Do not let anger make your decisions for you." With that grim warning, Martin slipped out of my study, leaving me alone in the dim light. I walked over to my oak desk and sat down in front of my computer. My daughter had secured our family trust with state-of-the-art encryption and biometric authentications. She thought the system was completely impenetrable, but she had forgotten one crucial detail. I was the one who built the foundation of the company 40 years ago. I hired the brilliant paranoid software engineers who laid the original digital architecture. I knew the root access codes. I had backdoor administrative keys, so old modern security software ignored them. I cracked my knuckles, letting the muscle memory of a lifetime of corporate warfare take over. I opened a command terminal and began typing strings of legacy code. The screen flickered, bypassing the glossy modern login portals and diving straight into the raw servers of the family trust. I bypassed the biometric locks with a master override. Within 15 minutes, I was inside Evelyn's private executive portal. I could see every transaction and pending file she was working on. I navigated through the labyrinth of digital folders until I found a hidden directory labeled with Preston's last name. My heart hammered violently as I clicked to open it. Inside was a single massive electronic file. It was heavily encrypted, but my root access tore right through the lock. The document opened on my screen, and the sheer audacity made me physically sick. It was a comprehensive, absolute power of attorney agreement. It was dozens of pages long, drafted with incredibly dense legal jargon, designed to trap the victim permanently. I scrolled through the clauses, my vision blurring with rage. This document granted him irrevocable control over the entire $40 million family trust. It gave him the power to liquidate prime real estate and transfer assets to offshore holding companies without needing her signature ever again. But the most horrifying section was a durable medical proxy clause. It gave him the legal right to place her in a psychiatric facility and dictate her medical treatments. I scrolled to the very last page. There at the bottom was Evelyn's digital signature. It was messy and uneven, clearly signed, while she was under the heavy influence of those white capsules. Next to her signature was the stamp of a private notary someone Preston had bribed heavily to look the other way. I checked the metadata of the document. I needed to know when this financial death warrant would take effect. My eyes locked onto a terrifying clause buried in the footnotes. The document was held in escrow. It was legally designed to trigger and become fully active on the exact date their marriage certificate was registered with the county courthouse in downtown Seattle. 14 short days. I had exactly 14 days before Preston Croft owned my daughter entirely. I leaned back in my heavy leather chair, staring blindly at the glowing screen. The urge to grab my hunting rifle and handle the problem the old-fashioned way was almost overwhelming. It would be so easy to kick the front door down, drag him out onto the lawn, and make him pay. But I forced my breathing to slow. I forced the cold, calculating businessman back to the surface. If I went to the police with this document, Preston would claim Evelyn signed it willingly to protect her assets during a severe mental health crisis. The police would go to the house to question her. Evelyn, completely drugged and brainwashed, would recite whatever script he had drilled into her head. She would tell the officers that she wanted Preston to manage her money. The police would leave. The second their squad car pulled away, Preston would panic. He would pack Evelyn into a private car, drive her across the border, trigger the power of attorney, and drain the $40 million. Law enforcement was completely useless against a man who used the law as his primary weapon. I could not outmuscle him, and I could not arrest him. There was only one way to defeat a parasite like Preston Croft. I had to understand exactly what drove him. He was a professional predator driven by an insatiable, blinding greed. $40 million was enough to make him patiently drug my daughter for months. But if I wanted him to abandon his carefully laid plans, if I wanted him to willingly step out of the fortress he had built around her, I had to offer him something much bigger. I had to build a trap so massive that his arrogance would blind him. I closed the terminal, the plan already forming in my mind. He wanted a fortune, so I was going to give him one. A fortune so incredibly vast that it would consume his every waking thought. I would dangle $150 million right in front of his greedy eyes and watch him willingly walk into his own total destruction. I knew exactly how to play the desperate, dying old man to absolute perfection. But before I could lay the final trap, I needed physical leverage. I needed the poison. Early the next morning, I sat in my unremarkable sedan, parked 3 blocks away from Evelyn's estate. I had paid a private security contact to slip a magnetic GPS tracker under the bumper of Preston's sleek black SUV during the night. I watched the blinking red dot on my tablet screen. At exactly 6 in the morning, the dot began to move toward downtown Seattle. Preston was a creature of intense vanity and rigid habit. He spent 90 minutes every single morning at an exclusive high-rise fitness club. That was my window. I followed his digital trail into the city. I parked my car in a concrete garage a few blocks away from his private apartment building. Martin had done his job perfectly the night before. He had handed me a thin, unmarked gray plastic keycard. It was a master clone programmed to bypass the electronic locks of Preston's luxury building. I checked my steel wristwatch. Preston had just swiped into the gym. I had exactly 45 minutes before he finished his workout, showered, and headed back to the apartment. 45 minutes to find the evidence that could put him in a federal prison. I stepped out of the car, pulling the collar of my dark coat up against the morning chill. The walk to the building was short, but my 78-year-old knees throbbed with a dull, familiar ache. Every step was a sharp reminder of my age, a physical penalty for the years spent walking on steel cargo ship decks. But while my joints were stiff and failing, my mind was running with razor-sharp clarity. I approached the sleek glass doors of the apartment building. The lobby was empty, save for a sleeping concierge. I held my breath, pressed the gray keycard against the scanner, and listened for the soft, green beep. The glass door clicked open. I slipped inside and walked straight to the elevator, pressing the button for the penthouse floor. The ride up felt agonizingly slow. The mirrored walls of the elevator reflected a tired old man with gray hair, but behind my eyes, the ruthless shipping executive from 30 years ago was fully awake. The elevator chimed softly. I stepped out into a quiet, carpeted hallway. Preston's door was at the very end. I pressed the cloned card to his lock. A heavy mechanical bolt slid back with a satisfying clank. I turned the handle and pushed the door open, stepping into the belly of the beast. I closed the door silently behind me, making sure it remained unlocked for a quick escape. I checked my watch again. 38 minutes left. The apartment was completely immaculate. It looked like a staged photograph in a high-end architectural magazine. There was no clutter, no personal photographs, no lingering smell of coffee or cologne. It was the sterile, perfectly curated den of a psychopath who left no human traces behind. I moved quickly, ignoring the dull pain in my legs. I started in the master bedroom, pulling open the heavy wooden drawers and running my hands under the mattress. I found nothing but perfectly folded designer clothes and expensive silk sheets. I moved to the master bathroom, checking behind the mirror, inside the medicine cabinet, and under the marble sink. It was completely empty of anything suspicious. I checked the kitchen, next opening every cabinet and inspecting the pantry. Just imported water and protein powder. The man was a ghost. He kept his living spaces entirely clean of his criminal activities. I glanced at my watch. 25 minutes left. A cold sweat broke out across my forehead. If I did not find the pills, my entire plan would fall apart. There was only one room left to check. I walked down the short hallway and pushed open the door to his private home office. The room was dark, dominated by a massive glass desk and floor-to-ceiling bookshelves. I turned on a small desk lamp, casting a dim yellow light across the room. I began opening the desk drawers. They were filled with blank, stationary, expensive fountain pens and meaningless tax documents. I checked the filing cabinets in the corner. Nothing but dummy corporation paperwork that Martin had already discovered. The frustration began to build in my chest like a tight coil. I stood in the center of the room, forcing myself to breathe slowly. 19 minutes. He would be finishing his workout soon. I closed my eyes and pictured the man I was hunting. Preston was arrogant. He loved luxury. He loved the illusion of control. He would not hide his most prized possessions in a mundane filing cabinet or a dusty basement locker. He would hide them somewhere he could see them, somewhere that made him feel powerful every single day. I opened my eyes and slowly scanned the room again, looking past the obvious hiding spots. My gaze landed on the top shelf of the bookcase behind his desk. Sitting between two heavy antique leather-bound books was a large, beautifully crafted mahogany cigar humidor. It was a stunning piece of woodwork polished to a high shine with brass hinges, but something about it was fundamentally wrong. I walked over and looked closely at the polished wood. Preston did not smoke, did not. There was no smell of tobacco in his apartment, his car, or on his clothes. A man obsessed with his physical fitness and pristine image would not keep a functioning humidor. I reached out and slowly opened the heavy wooden lid. Inside the box were a dozen incredibly expensive imported cigars, but I noticed the interior depth did not match the exterior height. I pressed my fingers firmly against the smooth cedar floor. It shifted slightly. I dug my nails in and pulled the false bottom out. Hidden underneath was a heavy matte black biometric steel safe. I stared at the glowing blue scanner of the biometric lock. A normal man would have hit a dead end right here. A fingerprint scanner is designed to be impenetrable without the physical presence of the owner. But Preston was a man driven by extreme vanity and arrogance, and that made him entirely predictable. When I met Martin at the diner, he did not just give me a cloned keycard to bypass the lobby. He also gave me a tiny clear plastic sleeve containing a specialized synthetic lifting tape. During that awful dinner at the upscale steakhouse when Preston was busy charming the waiter and flaunting my dead wife's vintage watch, he left his water glass completely unattended for a few brief moments. I had discreetly wiped my own prints from my wine glass and swapped it with his empty one, wrapping it carefully in a linen napkin and passing it to Martin later that same night. Martin used his former Federal Bureau of Investigation contacts to pull a perfect left thumbprint from the curved glass. I reached into my coat pocket with trembling hands and pulled out the small plastic sleeve. I peeled back the protective layer, exposing the synthetic print. I took a deep breath, steadying my shaking fingers. If this did not work, the safe would likely trigger a silent security alarm directly to Preston's phone. I carefully pressed the adhesive side of the tape against the center of the glowing blue scanner. I held my breath, the silence in the apartment roaring in my ears. For a terrifying second, the light flashed a harsh warning yellow. Then, with a soft mechanical click, the blue light turned green. The heavy steel door popped open just a fraction of an inch. I pulled the heavy door open, expecting to see stacks of stolen cash, offshore bank ledgers, or perhaps a loaded weapon. Instead, the safe contained something far more sinister. There were no guns. There was no money. There were only rows of identical small amber glass vials. None of them had medical labels. They were completely blank, filled to the brim with the exact same chalky white capsules I had seen Preston slipping into Evelyn's vitamin organizer the day before. The poison was right here in my hands. I reached inside and pulled out one of the vials. It was surprisingly heavy. Beside the neat rows of vials sat a small black leather-bound notebook. I grabbed the notebook and flipped it open. The pages were filled with Preston's neat, meticulous handwriting. It was a daily ledger, but it did not track finances. It tracked human destruction. At the very top of the first page was Evelyn's name, followed by her current weight, age, and blood type. Below that was a terrifyingly detailed daily log. He was tracking the exact dosages of the white capsules he was feeding her every single morning. Next to the dosage amounts were clinical notes describing her resulting cognitive decline in sickening detail. Increased lethargy today. Short-term memory fracturing. Subject exhibiting high susceptibility to verbal suggestion. It was a scientific diary of how he was systematically dismantling my daughter's beautiful mind. My hands shook with a violent, consuming rage. I wanted to burn the apartment to the ground, but I knew I needed the evidence to destroy him legally. I slipped 3 of the white capsules into my coat pocket. Then I pulled out my cell phone and rapidly took crystal-clear photographs of every single page in the ledger. I had just snapped a picture of the final page when a sound froze my blood. It was the loud, unmistakable mechanical clank of the front door deadbolt sliding open. The heavy wooden door creaked, and the sound of heavy footsteps echoed through the polished hallway. Preston had come home early. He had not finished his normal 90-minute workout. My watch showed I had only been in the apartment for 22 minutes. Panic seized my chest. I shoved the black ledger back into the steel safe, slammed the heavy door shut, and frantically dropped the mahogany false bottom back into place within the humidor. I closed the wooden lid just as the footsteps grew louder, moving purposefully toward the office. There was no time to reach the hallway without being seen. I threw myself toward the large built-in closet on the far side of the room. I slid the slatted door shut just as Preston walked into the office. I pressed myself flat against the back wall, hiding in the dark behind a row of heavy winter coats. I held my breath, terrified that the pounding of my heart would give me away. Through the narrow wooden slats, I watched him. He was still wearing his gym clothes, holding a plastic bottle of water. He walked directly toward the bookshelf. He stood right in front of the humidor, his hand hovering over the lid. If he opened it and noticed the slight shift in the false bottom, I was completely trapped. My hand instinctively reached for the heavy metal flashlight in my pocket, preparing for a brutal physical fight I could not possibly win. But Preston simply grabbed a charging cable from the desk, turned his back, and walked out of the room, heading toward the kitchen. I did not wait for him to settle. I silently slid the closet door open, crept across the office carpet, and slipped out into the hallway. I moved like a ghost, easing the front door open and slipping out. I did not wait for the elevator. I pushed through the heavy door of the fire stairs and began the agonizing descent down 12 flights of concrete steps. Every step sent pain shooting through my knees, but I did not stop until I reached the cold alleyway. I leaned against the brick wall, gasping for breath, clutching my coat pocket. I had the poison. Now I needed to know what it was. I did not go to the police station, and I did not go to a hospital. I drove directly to a private medical testing facility on the outskirts of the city. It was a discreet, high-end laboratory that catered to wealthy clients who demanded absolute privacy and immediate results. I walked into the sterile, brightly lit lobby, my damp coat still clinging to my shoulders. I bypassed the receptionist and demanded to speak directly with the head toxicologist. When a tall, stern-looking scientist finally emerged from the back doors, looking thoroughly annoyed by the interruption. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I pulled the 3 white capsules from my pocket and placed them on the pristine glass counter. Next to the pills, I placed a thick stack of $100 bills. I told him I needed a comprehensive chemical analysis of the contents, and I needed the results before the sun went down. I offered to pay triple his standard emergency fee in untraceable cash. The toxicologist looked at the money, then at the dirt and scratches on my face. He swept the pills and the cash into a secure envelope without asking a single question. He told me to go home and wait for his call. I drove back to my empty house, feeling the sheer exhaustion of the day settling deep into my bones. I poured myself a black coffee, sat in my dark study, and stared at the grandfather clock. The ticking echoed in the quiet room, a constant reminder of the time slipping away. Every second that passed was another second Evelyn spent under the control of a monster. To keep my mind from spiraling into panic, I uploaded the photographs of the black ledger from my phone to my secure computer terminal. I read through Preston's meticulous, cold-blooded notes again and again. He treated my daughter like a laboratory rat. He documented her failing memory, her confusion, and her physical weakness with the detached precision of a sociopath. I sat in that quiet rage for 6 grueling hours. The sun dipped below the Seattle skyline, casting long, dark shadows across my floor. At exactly 7 o'clock that evening, my cell phone vibrated violently against the mahogany desk. I snatched it up, pressing it hard against my ear. It was the toxicologist. But his voice had completely changed. Earlier that afternoon, he had been a detached professional. Now he sounded genuinely horrified, his breathing shallow and rapid. "Mr. Blake," he started, his voice trembling slightly. "I ran the mass spectrometry twice because I could not believe the initial readings. Where exactly did you get these capsules?" "That is none of your concern," I replied sharply. "Tell me what is inside them. Tell me what he is giving her." There was a heavy pause on the line. The doctor exhaled slowly. "Mr. Blake, this is not a sedative. This is not a heavy anti-anxiety medication, and it is certainly not a vitamin supplement. It is a highly synthesized chemical cocktail. The primary compounds are experimental neurotoxins typically used in advanced animal research to study severe neurological diseases. It is designed to aggressively target and destroy the hippocampus, the part of the brain responsible for forming and holding memories. My blood turned to ice. I gripped the phone so tightly my hand cramped. What does that mean for the person taking it? I demanded, my voice dropping to a harsh whisper. It means someone is chemically inducing early-onset Alzheimer's disease, the doctor said, the horror evident in every syllable. It attacks the neural pathways, causing profound confusion, extreme lethargy, and an inability to process reality. If a human being takes this daily, they will completely lose their cognitive functions. Their personality will be erased. Mr. Blake, based on the concentration in these capsules, if your daughter continues to ingest this for another month, the brain damage will be entirely permanent. She will never recover. She will be locked inside a broken mind for the rest of her natural life. You need to contact the federal authorities right this second. This is attempted murder. I hung up the phone without saying another word. The phone slipped from my fingers, clattering onto the hard wooden desk. I stood up, my legs trembling so violently, I had to grab the edge of the table to keep from collapsing to the floor. The room seemed to spin around me as the doctor's words echoed in my ears. Permanent brain damage. Chemically induced Alzheimer's. A slow, agonizing murder. Preston was not just stealing a trust fund. He was systematically killing the vibrant, brilliant woman I had raised. He was burning her soul to the ground just to line his own pockets. The profound grief that washed over me was instantly swallowed by a wave of pure, unadulterated hatred. It was a darkness so deep and cold it frightened me. I had spent my entire life building, protecting, and providing. But in that moment, standing alone in my dark study, I became something else entirely. I became an executioner. The toxicologist was right about the severity of the crime, but he was entirely wrong about the solution. Taking Preston to jail was no longer an option. If I handed that evidence over to the police, the legal system would take over. There would be hearings, bail applications, and endless trials. Preston would hire brilliant defense attorneys. He would claim the pills were a mix-up from an overseas pharmacy. He might even negotiate a plea deal and spend a few comfortable years in a white-collar prison, while my daughter spent the rest of her life in a specialized care facility, unable to remember my name. No. Jail was entirely too good for a monster like Preston Croft. A clean legal battle was an insult to the suffering he was putting my child through. I did not just want to stop him. I wanted to destroy him completely. A monster like Preston Croft operates on one fundamental principle: greed. He believed $40 million was the score of a lifetime. He was willing to poison the woman he claimed to love and risk federal prison just to get his hands on her trust fund. To break a man like that, I needed to show him a number so staggeringly large that it would completely short-circuit his cautious, calculating brain. To do that, I needed to make him believe I was no longer an obstacle, but an easy dying mark. I had to convince him he had completely won. I spent the entire next morning preparing my home for his arrival. I drove to a local medical supply store on the other side of the city and paid cash for a heavy-duty steel wheelchair. When I brought it home, I adjusted the lighting in my massive living room, pulling the heavy velvet drapes shut to cast the space in dark, depressing shadows. I dressed in an oversized, faded flannel bathrobe over a pair of wrinkled pajamas. I skipped my morning shave, letting the coarse gray stubble age my face by 10 years. I even went as far as to dab a little white powder on my cheeks and forehead to give my skin a sickly, pale pallor. I looked like a broken man standing on the very edge of the grave. At exactly noon, I picked up my phone and dialed Preston's number. When he answered, his voice carried that same patronizing, smug tone he used outside Evelyn's house. I forced my voice to tremble violently. I slurred my words slightly, making my breathing sound shallow and labored. I told him I had suffered a minor stroke during the night. I cried into the receiver, telling him I was absolutely terrified. I lied and said my private doctors had just left my house giving me a very grim prognosis. I told him I needed to speak with him immediately about Evelyn's future before my mind completely failed me. I practically begged him to come to my estate. He arrived less than 45 minutes later. The heavy brass doorbell chimed, echoing ominously through the quiet halls of my home. I wheeled myself slowly from the living room to the front door, making sure the rubber wheels of the chair squeaked loudly against the hardwood floor. When I reached up with a trembling hand and pulled the heavy door open, Preston stood on the porch wearing a sharp, tailored gray suit. The moment his dark eyes landed on me, sitting hunched over in the wheelchair, a flash of pure, unadulterated triumph crossed his handsome face. It was there for only a fraction of a second, but I saw it clearly. He thought the universe had just done his dirty work for him. He quickly buried that vicious joy beneath a carefully constructed mask of deep fake concern. "Oh my God, Harrison!" he gasped, rushing inside and placing a warm, heavy hand on my frail shoulder. "You look absolutely terrible. Why did you not call an ambulance immediately? I told you your heart could not take this kind of unnecessary stress. Let me help you into the living room right now." He moved behind me and pushed my wheelchair down the long, wide hallway. I kept my head bowed, my hands shaking uncontrollably in my lap to sell the performance. But beneath my lowered brow, my eyes tracked his every single movement in the reflections of the hallway mirrors. Preston was putting on a fantastic show of sympathy, speaking to me in soft, soothing tones, but his sharp eyes were darting everywhere. He looked at the oil paintings hanging on my walls, calculating their auction value. He admired the imported Italian marble floors. He looked at the antique vases sitting on the console tables. He was scanning my home the exact same way a starving vulture looks at a dying animal in the desert. He was already planning how he would liquidate my assets the very moment I was put in the ground. The arrogance radiating from him was so thick it was almost suffocating. He parked my chair near the unlit fireplace and sat directly across from me on the large leather sofa. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, playing the perfect role of the devoted future son-in-law. "Harrison, you really should not be alone in a house this big right now," he murmured smoothly, locking his eyes onto mine. "Evelyn is still far too fragile to hear about this stroke, but I am here for you." "What exactly did the doctors say? Is there anything at all I can do to make you comfortable?" I let out a long, rattling cough that shook my entire body. I reached out with a trembling hand, grasping his wrist tightly. My grip was intentionally weak and clammy, like an old man desperately clinging to his last remaining hope. "Preston," I mumbled, slurring my words and letting my jaw hang slightly slack. "I was entirely wrong about you. I thought you were isolating my daughter, but now I see the truth. I am dying, Preston. The doctors say my heart is failing rapidly and the stroke has weakened my cognitive abilities. I do not have much time left, and my greatest fear is leaving Evelyn alone in this dark world. She is so sick, and I cannot protect her anymore." Preston's eyes softened with mock pity, but I could feel his pulse quickening steadily beneath my fingers. He smelled blood in the water. "I know you love her, Preston," I continued, forcing a pathetic tear to roll down my powdered cheek. "I know you are going to marry her very soon. I need a man I can completely trust to take over everything, not just her little trust fund. I am talking about the real money. I am preparing to hand over everything I have built. Everything I have built," I repeated, letting my voice crack with manufactured grief. Preston leaned closer, his dark eyes wide and searching. He was trying to maintain his mask of sympathetic concern, but the raw hunger in his expression was completely undeniable. "What do you mean, Harrison?" he asked softly. "Evelyn already manages the family trust. That is $40 million. I shook my head slowly, letting out a pathetic, wheezing sigh. "The trust fund is just the surface, Preston. It is the public money, but it is not the real wealth. I spent 40 years running one of the largest private shipping logistics networks on the entire West Coast. There were cash transactions, unrecorded cargo manifests, and private deals made in international waters. I was a ruthless man back then, and I made sure my family would never ever be vulnerable. Preston's posture shifted. He was completely hooked. He moved to the very edge of the leather sofa, his hands clasped tightly together. "What exactly are you saying, Harrison?" I took a deep, shuddering breath. "I have a secret offshore holding company located in the Cayman Islands. It is now completely untraceable, fully legally insulated, and entirely disconnected from Evelyn's public trust fund. I have been quietly compounding the interest in those accounts for over 3 decades. It is currently valued at $150 million in liquid assets." The silence that filled the living room was absolute. Preston completely froze. The number hit him like a physical blow. $150 million. It dwarfed Evelyn's $40 million. I watched his pupils dilate. A faint flush of color crept up his neck. His carefully constructed mask of a caring therapist shattered into a million pieces, replaced by the sheer, unadulterated greed of a professional parasite who had just struck the ultimate gold mine. $150 million, Preston whispered, his voice trembling slightly, completely forgetting to sound like a concerned caregiver. "Yes," I choked out, forcing another tear to spill over my cheek. "But I cannot leave it to Evelyn. You have seen how sick she is. The doctors say she might never fully recover her cognitive abilities. If I give her the access codes to those offshore accounts, she will lose it all. I need a man, a strong, capable man, who loves her as much as I do, to take control of the holding company. I need to transfer the entire corporate entity into your name, Preston. I need you to promise me you will use that money to take care of my little girl for the rest of her life." Preston quickly composed himself. He reached out and grasped my trembling hand with both of his. "Harrison," he said, his voice thick with fake emotion, "I am absolutely honored that you would trust me with something so monumental. You have my absolute word as a gentleman and as a medical professional. I will protect Evelyn with my life. I will take on this heavy burden for you so you can rest peacefully, knowing she is entirely safe." I nodded weakly, letting a sigh of relief escape my lips. "Thank you, Preston. You do not know how much peace this brings my failing heart. My private wealth management lawyers have already drafted the initial transfer documents. We can sign them tomorrow afternoon at their downtown office, and the $150 million will be legally yours before the weekend." Preston's eyes gleamed with a predatory light. "Tomorrow afternoon is perfect, Harrison. I will clear my schedule entirely." I let a few seconds of silence pass before dropping the final devastating hook. "There is just one small complication," I murmured, looking down at my lap and wringing my hands nervously. Preston's grip on my hand tightened instantly. His voice dropped an octave, laced with a sudden sharp paranoia. "What kind of complication?" "My legal team is incredibly strict," I explained, keeping my voice frail and apologetic. "They ran a preliminary background check to prepare the offshore transfer documents. They discovered that you recently filed a medical and financial power of attorney over Evelyn. Because Evelyn is my direct heir, the lawyers consider this a massive legal conflict of interest. They explicitly told me that I cannot legally sign the holding company over to you while you hold active control over her public trust fund. They said it looks like you are attempting to monopolize the family assets," I continued, my voice trembling with fake anxiety. "They will not allow the transfer of the $150 million unless you officially and legally cancel Evelyn's power of attorney today. It has to be completely nullified before tomorrow afternoon, or the offshore deal is completely dead." I looked up at him with pleading, desperate eyes. "Please, Preston, the $40 million in her trust is nothing compared to the offshore accounts. Just cancel her paperwork. Let her trust fund sit dormant. Take my money instead. It is the only way my lawyers will allow the transfer. I am begging you. Do not let my daughter be left unprotected because of a legal technicality." Preston slowly released my hand. He leaned back against the leather sofa, his mind racing. I could practically see the gears turning in his head. He was weighing his options. It was a monumental decision, balancing his careful planning against unimaginable wealth. He had to make his final choice right now. On one hand, he had a guaranteed $40 million, but he had to marry a heavily drugged woman and manage her life to keep it. On the other hand, he was staring at a clean, untraceable $150 million offshore. To get the massive fortune, he had to willingly drop his legal control over my daughter. He had to step out of his fortified castle and leave his hostage behind. I sat in my wheelchair, coughing weakly, waiting for the wolf to take the bait. For the next 48 hours, my house felt more like a mausoleum than a home. I sat in my dark study, staring at the encrypted screen of my computer terminal, waiting for the wolf to make his move. Every passing hour was pure psychological torture. I knew the risk I had taken. Preston was a master manipulator, a man who successfully drained the fortunes of 2 other women without leaving a single trace. I had placed a massive gamble on his greed, but what if his paranoia was stronger? What if he realized the $150 million offshore account was a mirage? If he suspected a trap, he would not hesitate. He would trigger the existing power of attorney, liquidate Evelyn's $40 million trust fund, and disappear with her across an international border before the sun came up. I barely slept that night. I paced the hardwood floors until my knees ached drinking black coffee. I jumped at every random notification, every shadow that crossed the driveway. I pictured my beautiful daughter locked inside that house, her brilliant mind fading into a thick chemical fog. The guilt of leaving her there weighed on my chest like a physical anvil. I had to remind myself that a premature rescue would only give Preston the legal ammunition to take her away forever. I had to endure the agonizing waiting. I had to let him feel like he was the one in absolute control of the board. The silence of the house was deafening, broken only by the steady tick of the grandfather clock in the corner. Tuesday bled into Wednesday, and still there was no movement on the digital servers. My heart began to sink. Had he chosen the bird in the hand over the 2 in the bush? Had the 40 million been enough for his parasitic appetite? Then on Thursday morning at exactly 9:15, the encrypted terminal on my mahogany desk let out a sharp, piercing chime. My head snapped up. I dropped my coffee mug on the desk, the dark liquid spilling over the scattered papers, and lunged for the keyboard. I rapidly typed in the backdoor access codes, my fingers trembling so badly I had to retype the sequence twice. I accessed the private executive portal of the family trust. A new legal document had just been uploaded directly from the county clerk's office. I clicked the file, holding my breath, as the high-resolution scan loaded onto the screen. It was an official declaration of revocation. My eyes rapidly scanned the dense legal text, searching for the specific clauses. There it was. Preston Croft had formally, legally, and irrevocably surrendered his power of attorney over Evelyn Blake. He had relinquished his medical proxy. He had dissolved his financial guardianship. The greed had been entirely too strong. The promise of $150 million had blinded his cautious instincts. He had dropped his shield, stepped out of his fortress, and left himself entirely exposed. A wave of profound relief washed over me, so intense that my legs gave out. I sank heavily into my leather chair, burying my face in my hands. He took the bait. The wolf had bitten down on the steel trap. I did not have time to celebrate. Less than 2 minutes after the document cleared the server, my private cell phone began to vibrate violently against the desk. I stared at the glowing screen. It was Preston's number. I took a deep breath, forcing the ruthless persona back to the surface. I adopted the weak voice of a dying old man and pressed answer. "Good morning, Preston," I whispered, letting a pathetic cough interrupt my greeting. "Harrison, my friend." Preston's smooth voice purred through the speaker. "I just wanted to call and give you some excellent news. I understand your lawyer's concerns regarding the conflict of interest. As a gesture of my total devotion to Evelyn, I went to the courthouse this morning. I have officially canceled the power of attorney over her public trust fund. The legal pathway is entirely clear for us to move forward with the offshore holding company. Thank you, Preston. I wheezed, injecting fake tears of gratitude into my voice. You have taken a massive weight off my failing heart. I will call my legal team immediately. We can sign the transfer documents tomorrow afternoon at 1 o'clock, exactly as we discussed. Excellent, Preston replied smoothly, his tone practically dripping with arrogant victory. But I have one small condition for tomorrow, Harrison. My stomach tightened painfully. What kind of condition? I asked weakly. I am bringing Evelyn to the law office with me, he stated, his voice turning incredibly cold. She is going to sit right there in the boardroom and watch you sign every single page. She needs to see the transition of power with her own eyes. She needs to understand that I am not just her partner anymore. I am her sole provider. She needs to see exactly who her new caretaker is. The sheer malicious cruelty of his demand made my blood boil. He did not just want to steal my money. He wanted to parade my drugged, broken daughter in front of me to humiliate me. He wanted to completely break my spirit before I died. He wanted to establish psychological dominance over both of us. I dug my fingernails into my palms, forcing myself to swallow the violent rage. Of course, Preston, I murmured, sounding utterly defeated. Bring her. I want to see my little girl one last time before I go. I will see you tomorrow, old man, Preston sneered, before hanging up. I slowly placed the cell phone back down on the mahogany desk. I was no longer shaking. A terrifying, icy calm settled over my entire body. Preston thought he was bringing my daughter to a coronation. He had absolutely no idea that he was walking into his own public execution. I did not waste a single second after hanging up the phone. I dialed Martin Gallagher's encrypted number and told him the trap was set. Preston had legally surrendered his control over Evelyn, leaving himself completely vulnerable. It was time to bring in the heavy artillery. Martin contacted his former colleagues at the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Because we now had concrete physical evidence of the synthetic neurotoxins combined with the photographs of Preston's meticulous dosing ledger and his documented history of draining the accounts of his previous wives, the federal agents were more than eager to finally bring him down. But we needed him to confess on tape in a controlled environment where he could not run or destroy evidence. We chose the downtown offices of my corporate attorneys for the meeting. It was a massive, intimidating glass high-rise overlooking the gray waters of Puget Sound. At 6 o'clock the next morning, hours before the city woke up, Martin and a team of federal technicians swept into the primary executive boardroom. They worked with surgical precision, rigging the entire room with state-of-the-art surveillance equipment. They installed microscopic high-definition cameras inside the smoke detectors and behind the vents. They secured sensitive audio transmitters beneath the conference table and inside the leather chairs. Every single whisper, every movement, and every stroke of a pen would be broadcast directly to the federal agents, waiting silently in the adjoining observation room. By noon, I was in position. I sat at the long oak table strapped into my medical wheelchair. I wore an oversized, wrinkled suit that made my shoulders look hollow and frail. I practiced my shallow, ragged breathing, ensuring my hands trembled just enough to look entirely convincing. The quiet ticking of the wall clock mirrored the heavy, violent pounding of my own heart. I was terrified for my daughter, but I knew I had to maintain this pathetic facade for just a little while longer. At precisely 1 o'clock, the heavy mahogany doors of the boardroom swung open. Preston stepped into the room, and the sheer arrogance radiating from him was nauseating. He wore a brand-new, custom-tailored Italian suit that fit his frame perfectly. His dark hair was impeccably styled, carrying the smug posture of a conquering king stepping into his new castle. But my eyes did not stay on him for more than a second. My gaze immediately dropped to the person he was pushing in front of him. It was Evelyn. She was sitting slumped in a standard hospital transport wheelchair. My heart shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces, tearing at the inside of my chest. She looked significantly worse than she had just a few days ago. The synthetic chemical cocktail had taken a brutal toll on her body and mind. Her face was pale and gaunt, her jaw hanging slightly slack. Her eyes were completely vacant, staring blankly at the polished wood of the conference table without registering where she was or who was sitting across from her. Preston had deliberately heavily drugged her for this specific outing, ensuring she would be nothing more than a silent, compliant prop in his sick display of dominance. Seeing my daughter reduced to this catastrophic state ignited a fire of blinding hatred in my soul. Every instinct I possessed screamed at me to leap out of my wheelchair, grab Preston by his silk tie, and throw him through the plate glass window. But I forced my hands to stay flat on the table, letting them shake weakly. I forced my breathing to remain shallow. I looked up at him with the terrified, watery eyes of a defeated old man. Preston parked Evelyn's wheelchair right next to his own leather chair, deliberately positioning her so I would have to look at her broken state throughout the entire meeting. He sat down, unbuttoning his suit jacket with a smooth motion. He looked around the empty boardroom, a small patronizing smile playing on his lips. "I notice your legal team is not present, Harrison," he said, his voice echoing loudly in the quiet room. I decided not to bring my own counsel either. I figured we could keep this intimate. Just family, taking care of family. "My lawyers are waiting in their private offices," I wheezed, keeping my voice incredibly weak. "They prepared the documents this morning. They said we just need to sign, and they will notarize and file them immediately." Preston leaned forward, resting his elbows heavily on the polished oak table. He did not bother to hide the eager, hungry gleam in his dark eyes anymore. "I read the digital draft your team sent over to my secure email last night, Harrison. It is absolutely perfect. The corporate structuring for the $150 million holding company is incredibly thorough. I must admit, I am truly impressed by your hidden wealth. It is a brilliant setup." He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a heavy, expensive gold fountain pen. He clicked the cap off and set it down gently on the smooth wood. "So let us not drag this out and put any more unnecessary strain on your failing heart today," he continued smoothly. "I know exactly what the document says. Let us just get the paperwork out here, sign the transfer, and get this entire ordeal over with right now so I can take Evelyn back home to rest." Preston was entirely blinded by his own towering ego and the glittering promise of unimaginable wealth. He genuinely believed he was the smartest person in the room, outwitting a helpless father. He thought the draft he read last night was the final agreement. He had absolutely no idea that in the early hours of the morning, I had completely switched the final document sitting silently inside the leather binder. He was not about to sign a financial transfer today. He was about to sign his own absolute irrevocable destruction. I watched Preston reach across the smooth, polished oak table and pick up the heavy gold fountain pen. He held it between his fingers, rolling the cool metal, savoring the glorious moment of his ultimate victory. He looked at the thick, black leather binder sitting in front of me, then slowly shifted his dark, predatory gaze to my face. The mask of the caring son-in-law completely melted away, revealing the monster underneath. In the absolute privacy of this quiet boardroom, with no lawyers present, and my daughter rendered completely catatonic by his chemical cocktail, Preston felt absolutely invincible. He leaned forward, resting his heavy weight on the table, and brought his face so incredibly close to mine that I could smell the expensive mint cologne he wore. The corners of his mouth curled into a vicious, mocking sneer. "Do not worry, old man," he whispered, his voice dripping with pure malice. "You have served your purpose perfectly. Once the money clears the offshore accounts, I will make sure you are taken care of. I will put you in a very nice, highly secure psychiatric facility right next to Evelyn. You two can share a room. Maybe they will even let you push her wheelchair around the courtyard while your brain slowly rots away." My hands trembled on the armrests of my wheelchair, but this time the shaking was not an act. It was the physical manifestation of a rage so profound it threatened to tear my chest apart. I looked into his eyes, letting a few fake, terrified tears spill over my cheeks. "Please, Preston," I whimpered, letting my voice crack pitifully. "You promised me. You promised you would take care of my little girl." "Oh, I will take exceptionally good care of her fortune," he replied, letting out a dark, cruel chuckle. "Now slide the folder over here and let us finalize this transaction." I pushed the heavy black leather binder across the smooth table. Preston caught it and flipped it open with an arrogant flick of his wrist. He did not bother to read the heading on the first page. He did not check the legal clauses. He did not even glance at the dense paragraphs of text. His mind was completely consumed by the staggering number of $150 million. He was entirely blinded by his own towering ego and the absolute certainty that he had completely outsmarted a dying old man. He firmly pressed the nib of the gold fountain pen against the thick, expensive parchment. The sound of the pen scratching against the paper echoed loudly in the silent boardroom. It was the sound of a trap snapping shut. He signed the first page with a swift, practiced flourish. He turned the heavy sheet over without a second thought. He signed the second page, then the third. My heart hammered violently against my ribs, counting every single stroke of the pen. He was legally binding himself to every single word printed on those pages. He signed the fourth page, a small triumphant smile playing on his lips. Finally, he flipped to the fifth and last page. He pressed the pen down one last time, signing his full legal alias at the bottom of the document. Preston pulled the pen away and capped it with a sharp, satisfying click. He closed the heavy leather folder and slammed his hand down flat on top of it. He leaned back in his leather chair, exhaling a long, deep breath of pure satisfaction. He looked around the boardroom, then back at me, his eyes blazing with arrogant victory. There he declared, his voice ringing with absolute authority. "It is done. I own it all." For a moment the room was completely silent. The only sound was the shallow, drugged breathing of my daughter sitting beside him. I looked down at my hands resting in my lap. The fake tremors completely stopped. My breathing slowed, evening out into a calm, steady rhythm. The frail, terrified old man vanished into thin air. I placed my hands firmly on the armrests of the heavy steel wheelchair. I pushed myself up. My knees ached, but my legs were strong. I stood to my full height, towering over the boardroom table, rolling my shoulders back. My posture was perfectly straight, rigid, and unyielding. The transformation was so sudden, so absolute, that Preston physically recoiled in his chair. His dark eyes widened in sudden confusion. He stared at me, his arrogant smile faltering as he realized the dying old man in front of him had just evaporated. I looked down at him, my expression carved from solid granite. The air in the room grew instantly cold. "No, son," I said, my voice deep, resonant, and echoing with the ruthless power of a man who built a shipping empire with his bare hands. "You did not just take my money. You just signed your own confession." Preston froze completely. The color drained from his handsome face. He looked down at the black leather binder beneath his hand, then back up at me, a panic finally piercing through his massive ego. "What are you talking about?" he stammered, his smooth voice cracking with sudden terror. "I read the draft last night. It was a standard asset transfer." I did not answer him immediately. I simply reached across the table, grabbed the edge of the leather folder, and pulled it firmly out from under his hand. He was too shocked to resist. I opened the binder and turned the document around so he could clearly read the words printed on the very first page. His eyes darted down to the text, desperately scanning the legal jargon. He realized in a fraction of a second that the document he just blindly signed on all 5 pages was not a financial transfer of $150 million. It was a highly detailed, undeniable, and absolute admission of his horrific crimes. I watched the exact moment his arrogant, perfectly constructed reality collapsed into dust. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. When I spoke, my words cut through the silence like a freshly sharpened blade. You did not just sign a financial transfer, Preston. I explained, my voice steady and completely devoid of mercy. You just signed a sworn, notarized affidavit. You have legally confessed to the illegal offshore purchase of highly restricted synthetic neurotoxins. You have admitted to systematically poisoning my daughter, Evelyn Blake, with the deliberate intent of inducing chemical brain damage to steal her trust fund. I pointed a steady finger at the second paragraph of the document. I made sure to include all the details. I continued watching his eyes dart frantically across the page. I included the exact offshore bank routing numbers you used to purchase the chemicals. I included the precise daily dosages you documented in that little black leather ledger you keep hidden in the false bottom of your mahogany cigar humidor. I even included a full confession to the financial draining and institutionalization of your two previous wives, Victoria and Elena. You just legally verified every single word on these 5 pages with your own signature. Preston's chest began to heave. He took a staggering step back from the heavy oak table, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The blood had entirely drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly pale gray. He looked at his own signature at the bottom of the page, then up at me, his dark eyes wide with an animalistic panic. He realized I had not just broken into his apartment. I had completely dissected his entire criminal existence. You cannot do this, he stammered, his voice trembling so violently he could barely form the words. This is a trick. This document is completely invalid. We are alone in this room. I will just tear it up and burn it. Preston lunged forward, throwing his entire body weight across the polished conference table. He stretched his arms out, his fingers clawing desperately toward the black leather binder. He knocked over his chair, scrambling like a cornered rat, trying to destroy the only piece of physical evidence that could send him to a federal penitentiary for the rest of his life. But before his frantic fingertips could even brush the edge of the parchment, the heavy mahogany doors of the boardroom exploded open. The sound was like a gunshot in the quiet room. Preston froze, his arms still stretched across the table, his head whipping around toward the entrance. Martin Gallagher stepped into the room, his face a mask of cold, professional fury. Right behind him were 3 heavily armed agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation, wearing tactical vests and carrying drawn sidearms. They fanned out across the room with terrifying speed, immediately surrounding the conference table and cutting off any possible avenue of escape. Step away from the table and put your hands behind your head right now, one of the federal agents barked, his voice echoing off the glass walls. Preston scrambled backward, stumbling over the legs of the overturned chair. He hit the floor hard, tearing the knee of his custom Italian suit. He scrambled to his feet, holding his hands up in the air, but his mind was still desperately trying to run his usual con. He looked at the federal agents, his face contorting into a mask of innocent terror. He tried to summon his charming, victimized therapist persona one last time. "Officers, thank God you are here!" Preston cried out, his voice shaking with manufactured fear. "You have to help me. This man is completely insane. He is suffering from severe cognitive decline. He lured me here under false pretenses and forced me to sign a fake document under absolute duress. I am just trying to care for his sick daughter. Look at her. He is holding us both hostage." The lead agent did not lower his weapon. He did not even blink. He simply reached into his tactical vest and pulled out a small digital audio device. He pressed a button, and the crisp, clear sound of Preston's own arrogant voice filled the boardroom. "Do not worry, old man. You have served your purpose perfectly. Once the money clears, the offshore accounts, I will make sure you are taken care of. I will put you in a very nice, highly secure psychiatric facility right next to Evelyn." The recording continued, playing the exact sounds of the pen scratching against the paper, followed by Preston's triumphant declaration that he owned it all. The federal technicians had captured every single agonizing second of his arrogance. The boardroom was perfectly wired, and his confession was crystal clear. Preston's jaw dropped open. His eyes darted wildly around the room, searching the ceiling vents and smoke detectors, finally understanding the absolute magnitude of the trap he had willingly walked into. The charming facade shattered permanently. He was not a brilliant mastermind anymore. He was just a pathetic, greedy criminal who had been completely outplayed by an old man. Martin Gallagher stepped forward, grabbing Preston by the collar of his ruined suit and throwing him hard against the glass wall. The impact rattled the entire room. Martin pulled Preston's arms behind his back, and the harsh metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs snapping shut echoed loudly. "You are under arrest for federal fraud, extortion, and the attempted murder of Evelyn Blake," the lead agent announced, stepping forward to secure the prisoner. Preston completely lost his mind. As the cold steel bit into his wrists, he began to thrash wildly against the agents. He screamed in pure, unadulterated panic, his voice breaking into a high-pitched, hysterical wail. He kicked and thrashed, cursing my name, begging them to let him go. But the agents held him with an iron grip. I watched them drag the screaming, broken monster out of the room. As the heavy boardroom doors swung shut, cutting off the frantic screams of the man who had tried to destroy my family, a profound, heavy silence settled over the room. The federal agents had cleared the space, leaving only Martin Gallagher and myself standing near the polished oak table. But my eyes were no longer on the door. I turned immediately to the hospital wheelchair parked in the corner. Evelyn had not moved a single muscle during the entire chaotic confrontation. The sheer volume of synthetic chemicals coursing through her bloodstream had kept her completely paralyzed, trapped in a waking nightmare, while her own life hung in the balance. I rushed to her side, falling to my aching knees on the expensive carpet. I took her cold, limp hands in mine, whispering her name over and over, promising her that the monster was gone. Martin had already called for a specialized medical transport team. Within 10 minutes, paramedics flooded the boardroom. They did not take her to a standard public hospital. I had arranged for her to be transported directly to a highly secure, private neurological detoxification clinic, nestled deep in the evergreen forests outside the city. It was a facility specifically designed to handle severe chemical trauma and complex brain injuries. I rode in the back of the ambulance, holding her hand, watching the grim expressions of the medics as they monitored her erratic vital signs. The toxicologist had warned me that the damage might already be permanent. That terrifying thought echoed relentlessly in my mind as the sirens wailed through the gray Seattle afternoon. The first week at the clinic was an absolute nightmare of endless waiting and agonizing uncertainty. I rented a small room adjacent to Evelyn's intensive care suite and refused to leave the building. I sat in a hard plastic chair beside her bed for 18 hours a day, watching the steady drip of the intravenous fluids flushing the poison from her veins. The withdrawal process was incredibly brutal. As the neurotoxins slowly began to leave her system, her brain fought violently to reestablish its natural chemical balance. She suffered from raging fevers that soaked her sheets in sweat. She experienced severe full-body tremors that required the nurses to physically hold her down. There were terrifying nights when she would wake up screaming in pure blind panic, completely disconnected from reality, unable to recognize my face or remember her own name. During those dark hours, I felt a crushing, suffocating guilt. I sat there holding a damp cloth to her burning forehead, apologizing repeatedly for not seeing the truth sooner, for letting that predator cross the threshold of her home. The doctors were cautiously optimistic, but they could not offer any absolute guarantees. They explained that the hippocampus is a delicate, complex structure. We simply had to wait for the storm to pass and see what remained of her beautiful mind when the chemical fog finally lifted. Sitting in that quiet, sterile hospital room, listening to the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor, I had a lot of time to reflect on the long, violent trajectory of my life. I had spent 40 brutal years building and defending a global shipping empire. I spent decades fighting literal pirates on the open ocean. I had faced down ruthless smugglers, armed cartels, and cutthroat corporate raiders who wanted to tear my life's work apart. I built massive steel ships, hired teams of armed security contractors, and spent millions on legal defenses to protect my cargo. I was so incredibly proud of the impenetrable walls I had built around my family. I always believed the danger would come from the outside, from the dark, unforgiving waters of the world. But I was entirely wrong. The most dangerous predator I had ever encountered did not approach my life with a gun or a threatening demand. He approached with a charming smile, a tailored suit, and a bouquet of flowers. He walked right through the iron gates of my daughter's estate, sat down at my dining room table, drank my expensive wine, and called me family. He bypassed every single security measure I had ever built simply by appealing to my daughter's heart. It was a devastating, humbling realization. I had conquered the oceans, only to find the worst pirate sitting quietly in my own living room, slowly stealing the most precious treasure I possessed. The grueling battle dragged on into the second week, and then slowly bled into the third. Gradually, the violent tremors began to subside. Her fevers broke, leaving her exhausted, but resting peacefully. The medical monitors showed a steady stabilization of her neurological activity. On the morning of the 21st day, I was sitting in my usual chair by the window, watching the pale sunlight filter through the tall pine trees outside. I was reading a book, assuming she would sleep through the morning, as she had done for the past 3 weeks. Then I heard a soft, distinct rustling of the bedsheets. I turned my head, and my breath caught sharply in my throat. Evelyn was looking at me. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, her eyes were not dilated or vacant. The heavy, glassy fog that had clouded her vision was completely gone. Her eyes were sharp, focused, and beautifully clear. She looked around the bright hospital room, taking in the medical equipment, and then her gaze settled firmly back on my face. She did not look confused or terrified. She looked like the strong, brilliant woman I had raised. She slowly lifted her right arm from the hospital bed. Her muscles were weak from atrophy, but her movement was deliberate and purposeful. She reached her hand out toward me. I immediately leaned forward, tears blurring my vision, and placed my rough, calloused hand inside hers. I expected a weak grasp, but instead she wrapped her fingers firmly around mine. Then she squeezed my hand. 1, 2, 3. 3 distinct, intentional squeezes. It was our old signal, but this time it was not a desperate plea for help under a restaurant table. I looked up at her face. A soft, genuine smile slowly spread across her lips, reaching all the way to her bright eyes. "You saved me, Dad," she whispered, her voice raspy but perfectly steady. The nightmare was finally over. The meticulously documented confession that Preston signed was just the beginning of his absolute destruction. Martin Gallagher and his former colleagues at the Federal Bureau of Investigation did not just stop at the attempted murder of my daughter. They used the offshore banking routing numbers and the detailed chemical ledgers to blow his entire criminal history wide open. The federal prosecutors successfully linked his newly confessed methods directly to the tragic cases of his 2 previous wives, Victoria and Elena. By tracing the financial transfers from their drained accounts to the exact same offshore holding companies he planned to use for my money, they built an airtight, inescapable case. Preston did not even make it to a grand jury trial. When his high-priced defense attorneys heard the audio recordings and saw the mountain of financial evidence, they forced him to accept a plea deal. I was sitting in the federal courtroom on the day of his sentencing. He looked nothing like the arrogant, impeccably dressed predator who had sat at my dining table. He wore a standard bright orange prison jumpsuit, his posture slumped, his dark hair unkempt and thinning from the stress. The judge showed absolutely no mercy. Preston Croft received a combined sentence of 40 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. He will spend the rest of his natural life behind thick steel bars, completely stripped of his wealth, his charm, and his freedom. As the bailiffs placed the heavy chains around his wrists and led him out of the courtroom, he did not even dare to look in my direction. He knew the old lion had completely devoured him. While Preston began his miserable existence in a concrete cell, my beautiful daughter began the long, arduous journey of taking her life back. The road to recovery was not easy. The synthetic neurotoxins had caused severe trauma to her nervous system, and it took 6 full months of intense physical and cognitive therapy to completely clear the chemical fog from her brilliant mind. But Evelyn inherited the exact same relentless fighting spirit that built my shipping empire. She refused to be a victim. Her memories sharpened, her physical strength returned, and the fierce, independent fire in her eyes burned brighter than ever before. Exactly 1 year after that terrifying Sunday dinner, Evelyn walked back into the executive offices of our family trust. She reclaimed her position as the director of the $40 million portfolio. But she did not just return to the way things were. She implemented massive sweeping security protocols to ensure that no single person, not even a future husband, could ever seize control of her assets through a medical proxy again. Our relationship, once strained by the demands of our respective careers, transformed into an unbreakable bond. We no longer just share a Sunday dinner out of familial obligation. We share a profound, unspoken understanding of survival. She is my absolute pride and joy, and seeing her thrive today is the greatest victory of my entire life. As for me, the terrifying ordeal with Preston fundamentally changed how I viewed my own legacy. I had spent 40 years building a massive fortune by moving cargo across the oceans. But sitting in that hospital room watching my daughter fight for her sanity, I realized that true wealth is absolutely meaningless if it cannot protect the vulnerable from the monsters hiding in plain sight. I decided to take a significant portion of my offshore holdings and establish the Beacon Foundation, dedicated entirely to supporting victims of elder fraud, psychological abuse, and medical manipulation. I hired Martin Gallagher to head the private investigative wing of the foundation. We employ former federal agents, forensic accountants, and aggressive legal experts who offer pro bono services to families trapped in the exact same nightmare we survived. We hunt down the predators who use romance trust and the legal system to isolate and destroy the elderly and the vulnerable. I might be 78 years old, with failing knees and a bad back, but I have finally found my true calling. I am no longer just a retired shipping executive waiting for the clock to run out. I am a protector. Predators look for weakness. They scan the room for the lonely, the tired, and the trusting. They think age makes us blind. They think because our steps are slow and our hands tremble, our minds are weak and easily conquered. But they forget that old wolves have the sharpest teeth. We have survived decades of storms, betrayals, and battles they cannot even begin to comprehend. We know how to wait in the dark. We know how to spring the trap. Never ignore your gut feeling. If someone you love suddenly changes, if a new person in their life tries to isolate them behind a wall of fake concern, never ignore the signals. Fight for them, even when it means playing the fool to gather your strength. If you are watching this, share it. Send this story to your friends, your family, and anyone who might be blindingly trusting of a new perfect partner. Because somewhere out there, another predator is sitting at a dining room table smiling a perfect smile waiting to strike. Did you like my story, and which city are you listening from? Let us meet in the comments section below. If you liked the story, you can support me by sending a super thanks so I can keep bringing more life stories like this to the channel. Thank you so much for your sweet ongoing support. I am looking forward to reading your comments on the story. On the screen right now, you can see 2 new life stories that I highly recommend you watch next. There is so much more on my channel to explore. Do not forget to hit the like button and subscribe. I will see you in the next life story. With love and respect.